Hello friends, welcome to part 1 of the MetaDucky Race Appendix, Race, Racism, and what it means to be human. In the first installment, we're going to explain what race is, where the concept of race came from, and how the problems we're having today getting along are Darwin's fault. Again. Step 1. Define your terms. That joke you just told was racist. Oh, what do you mean by racist? Good question. According to Google, racist is a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or who believes that a particular race is superior to another. Oh, okay, I can see that. But also, according to Google, the use for racist as a word over time kind of took off like in the 1940s. Like, nobody even used it before that, apparently. Did racism not exist before the 1940s? Or does this mean something else about the way people thought about or talked about the race? Also, the word racism, kind of the same thing. Like 1940s, people are like, oh, we're going to use the word racism now. Like before that, it was like, not at all. Of course, in the 60s, it got real popular. Like there was disco and drugs and the word racism. I don't know if those things are related. I'm just saying, kind of weird. But racist is a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or believes a particular race is superior to another. What do we mean by race? What about you, the viewer? Have you ever heard anyone define this term? I haven't. Oh wait, what about Charles Darwin? Well, Charles Darwin used it in the title of his book. Now, most people know Charles Darwin's book as The Origin of Species, but the full title of the original publication was On Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Oy vey, Chuck. You need to edit. But what are these favored races Darwin mentions in the title of his book? Now, in one sense, the word races was used to just denote species. So Darwin is saying the preservation of preferred species. And as you can see by the illustration on the right there, Darwin's theory just goes from some species of bacterial, single-celled things to multi-celled things to worms to fish to lizards to some type of kangaroo, to some kind of monkeys to some kind of ape to... Wait a minute. It's Reggie Watts. We evolved into Reggie Watts? Or we evolved from Reggie Watts? What are you trying to say, Chuck D? I mean, if this were true, we would all be much more musically talented, because, you know, Reggie's got skills. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, on the left there, on the left represents what Darwin gave us for the evolution of human species. As you can see, it starts off with some kind of monkey evolving to some kind of ape. What's meant to be shown here is that the ape evolves into the Africans, who evolved eventually through various stages into the Asians, I guess, and then into, eventually, at the front of the line there, the white Europeans. But let's look into this a little bit further. What's been accepted for a long time, and is still today, for the evolution of humanity is called the out-of-Africa theory. So very simply, the human race evolved first in Africa. Now, you've seen this illustration. This is the March of Progress, wherein there's some kind of monkey thing evolves into some kind of ape thing, eventually evolves into humans. And that's kind of as far as most people tend to understand it, but there's more in this illustration than most people realize. The front of the line is the civilized white European man. Back here we have the African ape. But then the illustration, while perhaps not clearly labeled, the theory tells us that the missing link between the white European man and the African ape is the African man. On this evolution of humanity theory, out of Africa theory, the African man is the evolutionary stage between apes and what is considered the civilized white man. And that's not just my opinion, that's what Darwin said, as I will show you. First of all, from National Geographic, here are some of our sort of humanoid ancestors. As you can see, these things are not intended to be fully human, even though that depends who you ask. But see how they're depicted. Dark hair, brown eyes, dark skin. Now this is National Geographic, but what National Geographic also points out is that the evolutionary theory does not give us a context by which to consider all races equal. Because they ask the question, what is almost human? Where is that line drawn? The important thing is, where does fully human happen? And who gets to decide? Because somewhere in this continuum, there was an African ape, and at some point, that evolved to become the African man, the fully human African man. And then later on, through more stages of evolving upward and onward, came the white European. But who is it that decides that the African man is or is not as fully human as the white European? When National Geographic says almost human, where do they draw that line? Who gets to decide? Well, let's look at the words of Charles Darwin himself. Charles Darwin, upon meeting South American people, said this: "I could not have believed how wide was the difference between savage and civilized man. It is greater than between a wild and domesticated animal. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world." But Darwin had more to say about the differences between different species of human beings. Darwin wrote this: "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man," by which, of course, he meant white Europeans, "will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between a man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as of present, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla." So a few matters of clarification. What Darwin is saying is that someday civilized men will exterminate and replace the savage races of men. He's not saying savage species of animal, things that make it dangerous to live. He is distinguishing between what he considers different species of human, saying some are civilized and some are savage and animal-like, and that someday the civilized ones will exterminate and replace the savage ones so that throughout the world the only humans that exist are the civilized ones. What he considers to be the savage, low, animal-like races he describes as the Negro or Australian, and by Australian he means the Aborigines, which even according to National Geographic, the line there, the out of Africa theory, goes African ape, African man, then Australian Aborigine. Despite the fact that Australia is far away, National Geographic has decided that the next species of man to evolve is the next darkest. This can be found taught in the National Geographic video, The Journey of Man. So as Darwin describes his vision of the future, he not only says that we're going to exterminate the savage races of men, but also what he calls the anthropomorphous apes. So the apes that he considered to be almost as human as the savage races of human. These are the words of Charles Darwin. Is there any question where this philosophy would go if followed? I hope you liked this bit of orange. Thank you for liking and subscribing. And as always, friends, remember, Jesus loves you.